A housemaid is unjustly accused of theft by an influential neighbor who demands that the police take her into custody. Her boss, a millionaire businessman who has secretly admired her, decides to intervene and uses his influence to defend her. Over time, she realizes that her loyalty and respect for him are growing into something deeper. In the Richardsons' elegant mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, Maria Delgado methodically organized the dinner dishes, as she had done every night for 5 years. Her movements were precise and careful, reflecting a dedication that went beyond simple professional duty. Through the dining room window, the last rays of the October sun broke through the French glass, making the polished silver sparkle. Richard Richardson, owner of the mansion and CEO of one of the country's largest technology companies, was discreetly watching Maria work, hidden behind his digital newspaper. At 45, Richard had built an empire, but his personal life remained a void filled only by routine and the silent presence of his employees, especially Maria. "The silverware is especially shiny today, Maria," he commented, putting down his tablet and adjusting his thin-framed glasses. Maria smiled softly, her brunette hands contrasting with the metallic shine of the cutlery. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson. I used that new product that Mrs. Graham recommended." The mention of Mrs. Graham, the austere housekeeper who supervised the domestic staff, brought a moment of tension. Barbara Graham was known for her rigidity and for keeping a watchful eye on all the staff, especially Maria, whose competence she secretly envied. Across the street, in the Maxwell mansion, Lawrence Maxwell watched the scene through his own window. As president of the neighborhood council, he considered himself the moral guardian of the exclusive neighborhood. His critical eye often lingered on the figure of Maria, a presence he considered inappropriate for the refinement of the place. The afternoon passed normally until a sharp cry cut through the air. Mrs. Maxwell, Lawrence's wife, burst through the back door of their mansion, gesticulating frantically. "My diamond ring. It's gone. I'm sure it was in the bathroom cabinet this morning." The commotion attracted the immediate attention of the neighbors. Lawrence Maxwell quickly took charge of the situation, his authoritative voice echoing down the street. "Someone must have broken into the house today. Who's been here?" Maria, who occasionally helped out at the Maxwell house when asked, felt her stomach sink. She had been there earlier, cleaning the master bathroom at the request of Mrs. Maxwell herself. "The Richardsons' maid was here," declared Mrs. Maxwell, pointing an accusing finger in the direction of the neighboring mansion. "She was the only person who went into the bathroom today." Richardson, who had come out to see what was going on, instantly realized the seriousness of the situation. His gaze met Maria's, who stood paralyzed in the doorway of the mansion, still holding a silver cloth. "This is absurd," Richard declared, his voice firm and controlled. "Maria has worked for me for years. Her honesty is unquestionable." Lawrence Maxwell stepped forward, his imposing bearing becoming menacing. "With all due respect, Richardson, but you can't vouch for someone's character just because they work well. I've already called the police." Panic began to set in Maria's eyes. As a legal immigrant, but still vulnerable, she knew that an accusation of theft could destroy not only her job, but the entire life she had built in the United States. "Senor Richardson," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I swear to God I didn't take anything." Richard felt something stir inside him, a mixture of protectiveness and indignation. He knew Maria well enough to recognize the truth in her words. In the 5 years she had been working in his house, there had never been a single item out of place, let alone missing. The arrival of the police cars turned the quiet street into a crime scene. 2 officers approached, notebooks in hand, while curious onlookers began to crowd the immaculate sidewalks. "Ms. Delgado," one of the officers called out, "we're going to need you to come with us for some questioning." It was at this moment that Richard Richardson made a decision that would change the dynamic of the whole situation. Placing himself between Maria and the officers, he spoke with the authority of someone used to running boardrooms. "Officers, I'm Richard Richardson, CEO of Richardson Tech. Maria Delgado works for me, and I can vouch for her trustworthiness. Before any questioning, my lawyers will be present." With a quick movement, he picked up his phone and typed a message. In a matter of minutes, a legal team would be on its way. Mrs. Graham watched the scene from the doorway of the mansion, her face a mask of concern and something more, perhaps a hint of satisfaction at the confusion that had arisen. Maria, still in shock, watched her boss's display of confidence with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. In 5 years of work, she had never seen Richardson so directly involved in any employee-related situation. The sun was beginning to set over Greenwich, casting long shadows over the imposing mansions. What had begun as just another normal day in the life of Maria Delgado had turned into the start of a journey that would not only test her resilience, but also reveal surprising truths about the people around her. Lawrence Maxwell kept his gaze fixed on Maria, like a predator watching its prey. "It's not going to stay that way, Richardson. There are principles to be upheld in this neighborhood." Richard, normally reserved and diplomatic, felt a surge of irritation that surprised him. "And there are principles of justice and dignity that need to be respected, Maxwell. I will not allow an exemplary employee to be humiliated without proof." As night fell over the exclusive street, the battle lines were clearly drawn. On one side, the power and prejudice represented by the Maxwells. On the other, the unexpected alliance between a powerful businessman and his housemaid. At the center of it all, a missing ring and an accusation that threatened to destroy much more than reputations. The interrogation room at Greenwich Police Station was a stark contrast to the luxurious mansions of the upscale neighborhood. Maria Delgado sat upright in the metal chair, her hands intertwined on the cold table, as she watched her distorted reflection in the one-way mirror. On the other side of the table, 2 detectives studied her with neutral expressions, trained by years of experience. "Ms. Delgado," began the older detective, consulting his notes, "can you tell us exactly what you did at the Maxwell residence this morning?" Maria took a deep breath, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Yes, senor. Mrs. Maxwell asked me to clean the main bathroom, as she does occasionally. I arrived at 9 o'clock, cleaned the bathroom, and left at 10. I didn't touch anything apart from the cleaning products." Outside the room, Richard Richardson was talking quietly to Marcus Bennett, head of his legal team, who had arrived in record time. "We need to resolve this quickly, Marcus. Maria doesn't deserve to go through this humiliation." Bennett adjusted his tie, years of experience in complex cases evident in his posture. "The charges are flimsy, Richard. There's no hard evidence, just the Maxwell's word against hers. But we need to be careful. Lawrence Maxwell has a lot of influence in this town." Meanwhile, at the Maxwell mansion, Barbara Graham, the Richardson housekeeper, paid an unscheduled visit. Under the pretext of offering support to Mrs. Maxwell, she carefully observed the details of the house. "It's simply shocking," lamented Mrs. Maxwell, gesturing dramatically. "That ring was a family heirloom. How can we trust anyone these days?" Barbara listened with calculated attention, her shrewd eyes registering every detail. "Really terrible, Mrs. Maxwell. But are you sure you looked everywhere? Sometimes small objects can slip into unexpected places." At the police station, the interrogation continued. The younger detective placed a photograph of the missing ring on the table. "This is a valuable item, Mrs. Delgado, valued at over $50,000. A considerable temptation for someone on your salary." Maria felt her blood boil, but kept her composure. "Senor, I've been working for Mr. Richardson for 5 years. I clean much more valuable jewelry than that every day. I've never taken anything that doesn't belong to me." Richard, who was watching through the glass, felt a mixture of pride and concern when he saw the dignity with which Maria carried herself. Over the last 5 years, she had become much more than just an employee. She was an integral part of his home, a constant presence who brought order and tranquility to his hectic life. "Marcus," he said, turning to his lawyer, "I want you to investigate the Maxwells. Something's not right about this story." Bennett arched an eyebrow. "Do you have anything specific in mind?" Lawrence Maxwell has always been against the presence of immigrant employees in the neighborhood. He tried to pass several regulations in the neighborhood council to make it difficult to hire them. This could be personal. At the Maxwell home, Barbara Graham continued her discreet investigation. During the conversation, she noticed something curious. Mrs. Maxwell constantly touched a pearl necklace, a nervous gesture that seemed more pronounced when she talked about the ring. "It's a shame the police had to get involved," Barbara commented, studying Mrs. Maxwell's reactions, especially with someone who has worked in the neighborhood for so long. Mrs. Maxwell hesitated for a moment. Well, rules are rules, and Lawrence insisted that we needed to set an example. Back at the police station, after hours of questioning, Maria was finally released, but with the warning to remain available for further questioning. Richard was waiting for her in the lobby, his face showing genuine concern. "I'm going to take you home, Maria," he said, gently guiding her to his car. During the journey, a heavy silence hung in the air. Maria stared out of the window, watching the elegant streets of Greenwich pass by like a blur. "Senor Richardson," she finally said, "why are you helping me so much?" Richard kept his eyes on the road, but his voice betrayed restrained emotion. "Because I know your character, Maria, and because," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "because you deserve to be defended." When they arrived home, they found Barbara Graham waiting in the doorway. Her face was more tense than usual, as if she was guarding important information. "Mr. Richardson," she said, casting a meaningful glance at Maria, "I think I've discovered something that might interest you about this situation." Richard realized that the day was far from over. As he drove Maria and Barbara to their office, he noticed Lawrence Maxwell watching them from the window of his house, his face a mask of disapproval. The sun was beginning to set over Greenwich, casting long shadows over the imposing mansions. In the Maxwell house, Mrs. Maxwell rummaged nervously through her drawers, as if looking for something, or trying to hide something. On her neck, the pearl necklace seemed to weigh more than usual. The truth, like the shadows stretching across the perfectly kept gardens, was beginning to creep into unexpected corners, threatening to reveal secrets long kept in that seemingly perfect neighborhood. Richard Richardson's office was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, overlooking the mansion's meticulously tended gardens. Barbara Graham stood, her hands clasped in front of her as Maria settled into one of the leather armchairs, still visibly shaken by the day's events. "During my visit to the Maxwell house," Barbara began, her tone measured and precise, "I noticed something peculiar in Mrs. Maxwell's behavior. She was extremely nervous, especially when I mentioned the possibility of a more detailed search." Richard leaned forward in his chair, his fingers interlaced on the table. "Go on, Barbara." She kept up a repetitive gesture, Barbara demonstrated, touching her own neck. "Every time we talked about the ring, she would nervously adjust a pearl necklace. And more interestingly," she paused dramatically, "I overheard a partial conversation on the phone, something about sort it out quickly, and before Lawrence finds out." Maria, who until then had kept her eyes downcast, looked up. "Senora Maxwell has always been kind to me. I don't understand why she would allow such an accusation." "Fear," Richard replied, getting up to pour himself a drink. "The question is, afraid of what? Or of whom?" At that moment, Richard's phone rang. It was Marcus Bennett, his lawyer. "Richard, I've got some interesting information about the Maxwells. It seems they're in financial trouble. Lawrence made some risky investments that didn't work out. They're keeping up appearances, but things aren't looking good." Richard hung up the phone and shared the information with Barbara and Maria. A picture was beginning to form, but important pieces of the puzzle were still missing. "Senor Richardson," Maria spoke up, her voice firm despite the situation, "I don't want to cause any more trouble. Perhaps I should look for another job, somewhere else?" "Absolutely not." Richard's reply was immediate and emphatic. "I'm not going to allow an injustice to force you to abandon a life you've built honestly." He hesitated for a moment before adding, more gently, "You are important to this house, Maria." Barbara watched the exchange with interest, her keen eyes noticing something else in her boss's words and tone. The evening was progressing when they were interrupted by an unusual movement outside. Through the office window, they saw police lights reflecting off the walls of the Maxwell mansion. "Something's going on," Barbara muttered, approaching the window. Richard immediately picked up his phone, calling his contacts at the local police. After a brief conversation, his face showed a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. "Mrs. Maxwell has just confessed to inventing the theft of the ring," he announced. "Apparently, she sold it weeks ago to cover some debts, without her husband's knowledge." Maria let out a sigh of relief, silent tears streaming down her face. "Thanks be to God." But the story didn't end there. Lawrence Maxwell had arrived home in the middle of his wife's confession, and now a heated argument could be heard even through the thick walls of the neighboring mansion. "This is going to cause quite a scandal," Barbara commented, a slight smile of satisfaction on her lips. Richard approached Maria, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Now we need to think about how to completely clear your name. A confession isn't enough. I want everyone to know that you've been wrongly accused." Maria looked up, meeting her boss's eyes. At that moment, something subtly changed between them. The touch on her shoulder, which should have been comforting, carried an unexpected electricity. Barbara, sensing the intensity of the moment, discreetly left the office, muttering something about preparing a soothing cup of tea. "Why do you care so much, Senor Richardson?" Maria asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. Richard removed his hand from her shoulder, walking over to the window. "Because," he began, choosing his words carefully, "because you represent something I deeply admire, Maria. Integrity, dignity, and because," he stopped, letting the unspoken words hang in the air. Outside, the confusion in the Maxwell house was growing. Neighbors began to gather, smartphones in hand, capturing the drama that was unfolding. Greenwich's perfect facade was beginning to show its cracks. "I'm going to make a public announcement tomorrow," Richard declared, turning to Maria. "I'm going to tell everyone how you were wrongly accused and how the Maxwells tried to destroy your reputation to cover up their own problems." "That's not necessary, Senor," Maria protested. "The truth has already come out." "Yes, it's necessary," Richard insisted, "because sometimes it's not enough for the truth to come out. It needs to be proclaimed. And because," he hesitated again, "because you deserve more than just a whispered retraction." The silence that followed was full of meaning. Maria realized that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with Richard. The man she had always watched from a distance, hiding behind his digital newspaper, had become her staunchest defender. Barbara returned with the tea, finding the two of them in contemplative silence. Through the window, they saw Lawrence Maxwell hurriedly leaving his house, getting into his car and driving off into the night, leaving behind a tearful wife and a crumbling empire of appearances. "Secrets have a way of coming out," commented Barbara, pouring the tea, "especially those buried under layers of pride and prejudice." Maria accepted the cup with trembling hands, still processing the day's events. Richard watched her discreetly, his heart beating in a way he hadn't felt for a long time. The night in Greenwich promised more revelations, as masks continued to fall and long-buried truths emerged to the surface. The next morning dawned with a different Greenwich. The Maxwell scandal had spread like wildfire through the exclusive neighborhood messaging groups. Richard Richardson watched through the window of his office as reporters began to flock to the gates of the Maxwell mansion. "It's like watching a house of cards collapse," commented Marcus Bennett, who had arrived early to discuss the communication strategy. "Lawrence Maxwell has always presented himself as the moral guardian of this community. Now everyone will see the hypocrisy behind the facade," added Richard, adjusting his glasses. "How are the preparations for the press conference going?" "Everything's ready. At 2 in the afternoon, as planned. I've managed to secure the presence of the main local media outlets and a few national ones." Maria entered the office carrying a tray of coffee, her presence causing a moment of silence. Despite the vindication of her innocence, her hands still trembled slightly as she poured the cups. "Maria," Richard called softly, "you don't have to work today. You should rest." "Con todo respeto, Senor Richardson. I prefer to stick to my routine," she replied, her eyes meeting his briefly. "Work helps me to think clearly." Barbara Graham appeared in the doorway, her countenance softer than usual. "Mr. Richardson, Mrs. Maxwell is here. She asks to speak to you." And Maria. A tense silence filled the room. Richard looked at Maria, leaving the decision in her hands. She nodded slightly. "Bring her in, Barbara," Richard ordered. Eleanor Maxwell entered the office like a shadow of her former self. Her eyes were red and puffy, her usual designer ensemble replaced by simpler clothes. The famous pearl necklace was absent. "Richard." "Maria," she began, her voice breaking, "I've come to apologize in person. What I did was unforgivable. Maria remained silent, her hands clutching her apron tightly. Richard approached, keeping a protective posture next to her. "Why, Eleanor?" he asked. "Why did you allow this lie to go so far?" Eleanor dropped into an armchair, tears streaming down her face. "Lawrence, he was losing everything. Our investments, our social position. I sold the ring to cover some urgent debts. When he asked about the jewel, I panicked. It was easier, more convenient, to blame someone who had no power to defend herself," Richard added, his voice laced with disappointment. "But she did," replied Eleanor, looking directly at Maria. "She had you." The comment hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meanings. Maria felt her heart race, aware of Richard's gaze on her. "Lawrence left the house last night," Eleanor continued. "He left a note saying he couldn't bear the scandal. I'm alone now, facing the consequences." "As it should be," Barbara interjected from the doorway, where she stood like a silent sentinel. Maria finally spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Senora Maxwell, your actions could have destroyed not only my reputation, but my entire life in this country." "I know," whispered Eleanor, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Richard approached her desk, picking up an envelope. "Eleanor, I brought this for you. It's a contact from one of the best family law attorneys in New York. You'll need proper legal representation." Eleanor looked at the envelope in surprise. "After all I've done." "I'm not doing this for you," Richard interrupted. "I'm doing it because I believe that everyone deserves the chance to rebuild their life with dignity, something you almost took away from Mary." At that moment, Marcus Bennett sniffed discreetly. "Richard, we need to revise your speech for the press conference." Eleanor stood up, understanding the cue. Before leaving, she turned one last time to Maria. "I'm sorry, truly." After she left, the office fell into a contemplative silence. Barbara approached Maria, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You were stronger than I would have been," the housekeeper commented. Maria shook her head. "I wasn't strong, Senora Graham. I just got tired of being afraid." Richard dismissed Marcus and Barbara with a gesture, remaining alone with Maria in the study. The morning sun streamed through the windows, creating golden patterns on the carpet. "Maria," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I want you to know that, whatever happens today at the press conference, your position in this house is more than secure." "Gracias, Senor Richardson." "But, Richard," he interrupted her. "Please call me Richard when we're alone." The apparently simple request carried significant weight. Maria felt her cheeks blush slightly. "Richard," she tried the name, feeling its intimacy. "Why do you care so much?" He approached, stopping a few steps away from her. "Because sometimes you find value where you least expected, and because—" He hesitated, struggling with unspoken words. The moment was interrupted by Barbara, who hurried back. "Mr. Richardson, the reporters, they found out about the Maxwell's financial problems. They're speculating about possible fraud." Richard sighed, the weight of reality breaking the moment. "I need to get ready for the press conference." "Maria, go," she smiled softly. "Do what needs to be done." While he left with Barbara for the final preparations, Maria remained in the office, her heart beating to a different rhythm. The walls of the Richardson mansion, which for so long had been just her place of work, were beginning to mean something more. Something she wasn't yet ready to name, but which was growing silently, like a stubborn flower between the cracks in a wall of social convention. The press conference in the main hall of the Richardson mansion turned the quiet estate into a whirlwind of activity. Cameras, microphones, and journalists swarmed as Richard Richardson, impeccable in his Italian suit, prepared to make his speech. Maria watched everything from the kitchen, through a small television that Barbara had installed especially for the occasion. Her hands were shaking slightly as she prepared coffee for the staff assisting with the event. "He's going to defend his honor like a knight in shining armor," Barbara commented, her usual stern tone replaced by something close to tenderness. "I've never seen Mr. Richardson so determined." Maria blushed slightly, concentrating on the task of organizing the cups. "It's just his sense of justice, Senora Graham." "Oh, dear," Barbara smiled knowingly. I believe it's much more than that. In the main room, Richard adjusted his microphone, while Marcus Bennett gave the last instructions. The cameras started broadcasting live when he finally positioned himself at the pulpit. "Good morning," he began, his voice firm and clear. "We are here today to shed light on an incident that has not only unfairly tarnished the reputation of a person of integrity, but has also exposed prejudices and privileges that have no place in our society." In the kitchen, Maria held her breath. Barbara held her hand in silent support. "Maria Delgado has worked in my house for 5 years," Richard continued. "During that time, she has demonstrated not only exceptional competence, but an integrity that many in our privileged community seem to have forgotten. The false accusation made against her was not only an act of desperation by the Maxwell family, but a reflection of deep-rooted prejudices." The journalist leaned forward, eager for every word. Across the street, the few lights came on in the Maxwell mansion, shadows moving behind the curtains. Mrs. Maxwell confessed that she made up the story of the robbery to cover up her own actions. But the real crime here wasn't just the false accusation. It was the ease with which some in our community were willing to believe that someone, simply because of their origin or social position, would automatically be guilty. In the kitchen, tears flowed freely down Maria's face. Barbara kept a protective arm around her, while other house staff gathered in silent support. As Maria Delgado's employer, I could have simply dealt with this behind the scenes. But as a human being, I feel an obligation to make public not only her innocence, but also her extraordinary dignity in the face of such an unjust situation. Richard paused, his eyes briefly moving in the direction of the kitchen, as if he could see through the walls. "This house," he continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "doesn't just work because of my presence. It's the dedicated work of people like Maria that makes it possible for me to conduct my business, to live my life. And it's time we recognize that every role, every person, deserves equal respect and dignity." The camera flashes intensified when Richard announced that he was suing Lawrence Maxwell for defamation and social prejudice, with all compensation going to a legal aid fund for domestic workers. When the press conference was over, Maria felt as if she could breathe for the first time in days. Barbara gently led her to Richard's office, where he was already waiting for them, his tie slightly loosened after the tension of the moment. "Maria," he said softly when he saw her, "I hope you haven't overstepped my bounds." "No, senor." "Richard," she corrected herself, remembering his earlier request. "It was perfecto." Barbara discreetly left, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotion. "You risked a lot for me," Maria finally spoke, her voice low but firm. "Your reputation, your social relationships." Richard approached, stopping just a few steps away from her. "Some things are more important than social reputation, Maria. Some people are more important." Her heart raced at the intensity of his gaze. "Why?" she whispered, although something inside her already knew the answer. "Because for 5 years," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I've watched your strength, your dignity, your kindness. Because every morning, your smile lights up this house in a way that all expensive works of art never could. Because..." A knock on the door interrupted the moment. Marcus Bennett rushed in, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. "Richard, the journalists are asking for more details about the case against Maxwell. And there are some reporters who want to talk to Maria." "No," Richard replied firmly. "Maria has been through enough. Any communication will be made through our lawyers." Maria noted the protective way he positioned himself, how his words, although directed at Marcus, were clearly meant to reassure her. "Gracias," she murmured as Marcus left. "For everything." Richard turned to her, his eyes softening. "Maria, when all this is over, when the dust settles, there's a lot we need to talk about." She nodded, her heart beating in a new and frightening rhythm. "Sí, hay mucho que decir." Through the office window, the afternoon sun cast golden shadows, creating a moment suspended in time. Social masks had fallen away, revealing long-held truths. And while the scandal continued to unfold across the street, inside that office, something new and fragile was beginning to blossom, challenging the social conventions and barriers that had kept them apart for so long. The morning after the press conference brought an uneasy calm to the Richardson mansion. The journalists had dispersed, leaving only sensationalist headlines and fragments of recordings that circulated incessantly on social media. Maria was organizing breakfast with her customary care. Although her hands occasionally paused on the fine china, her thoughts wandering to the events of the previous day. Barbara Graham watched her protégé with maternal attention as she supervised the organization of the house. "The tabloids are having a field day with the Maxwells," she commented, showing her tablet. "Lawrence hasn't turned up yet, and Eleanor is practically under house arrest." "I take no pleasure in their suffering," Maria replied softly, adjusting a solitary rose in the center of the breakfast table. "Sometimes people get so lost in keeping up appearances that they forget who they really are." "Speaking of appearances," Barbara hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "I noticed how Mr. Richardson looks at you now. Different." Maria felt her cheeks burn. "Please, Senora Graham," Barbara corrected the housekeeper with a rare smile. "After all we've been through together, I think we can dispense with a few formalities." Her moment was interrupted by the arrival of Richard, who entered the dining room adjusting his tie. He stopped briefly when he saw Maria, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent recognition before they both looked away. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "How's the mood in the neighborhood today?" "Tense," Barbara replied. "The neighbors are divided. Some publicly support Maria, others—" She left the sentence hanging in the air. "Others prefer to keep their concerns about social status to themselves," Richard added, taking a seat at the table. "Marcus informed me that 3 more families have withdrawn their investments from Lawrence's companies." Maria started to pour the coffee, but Richard gently grabbed her wrist. "Sit with us, please." Barbara, too. The housekeeper arched an eyebrow in surprise, but obeyed. Maria hesitated before taking a chair, feeling out of place in this new arrangement. "We need to discuss some changes," Richard continued. "This situation has exposed problems that go beyond a simple false accusation. It's about power structures, deep-rooted prejudices, and unspoken feelings," Barbara added quietly, noticing how her boss blushed slightly. "Yes," Richard admitted after a pause. "That too." Maria kept her eyes fixed on her coffee cup, her heart beating wildly. "Senor Richard, maybe this isn't the time to—" "It's exactly the time," he interrupted her gently. "I've spent 5 years watching you turn this house into a home. 5 years of pretending I didn't notice how your presence lit up every room. 5 years of hiding behind social conventions that this whole situation has proved to be empty." Barbara discreetly stood up. "I'll go and see if the gardeners need any guidance," she muttered, leaving them alone. The silence that followed was thick with unrealized possibilities. Through the French windows, the garden was beginning to awaken under the morning sun, dew sparkling on the petals of the roses that Maria tended so lovingly. "I'm afraid," Maria finally admitted, her voice almost a whisper, "afraid that this is just gratitude on your part, or worse, pity." Richard stood up, walking over to the window. "Do you know why I always read my digital newspaper here every morning? Because it's the only time I can watch you without it seeming obvious. See how you take care of every detail, how you smile while arranging the flowers, how you sing softly in Spanish when you think no one is listening." Maria felt tears forming in her eyes. "This is going to complicate everything." "Everything is already complicated," he replied, turning to her. "But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm being true to myself." The sound of a car braking suddenly interrupted the moment. Through the window, they saw Lawrence Maxwell walking determinedly towards the Richardson mansion, his face contorted in fury. "How dare you?" he shouted as Barbara reluctantly opened the door. "Destroy my reputation, my business, my life?" Richard instinctively put himself between Maxwell and Maria. "You destroyed all that yourself, Lawrence. Your choices, your prejudices, your lies. Because of a maid?" Maxwell spat out the words. "You threw away years of friendship, social connections, everything for her?" "No," Richard replied calmly. "For justice, for dignity, and yes, for her. Because Maria has more integrity in one day's work than you've shown in your entire life of privilege." Maxwell advanced menacingly, but stopped when he saw Barbara discreetly activate the security system. "This isn't over, Richardson. You may have won the battle of public opinion, but—" "Yes, it's over," Maria interrupted, surprising everyone by standing up. "You destroyed your own life with pride and prejudice. Don't blame others for your choices." Lawrence Maxwell seemed to wilt in the face of Maria's calm dignity. Without another word, he turned on his heels and left, leaving only the echo of his angry footsteps. As the door closed, Richard turned to Maria. "I'm sorry about that." "No," she smiled softly. "Don't apologize. For the first time, I feel really strong." Barbara reappeared with a worried expression. "The reporters are coming back. Apparently, someone alerted the press about Maxwell's visit." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is never really going to end, is it?" "Maybe it doesn't have to end," Maria replied. "Maybe it just needs to change." Their gazes met again, full of unspoken promises and unexplored possibilities. Barbara watched the scene with a knowing smile, while outside, the sun continued its ascent, promising a new day of discoveries and transformations. The Richardson mansion, which for so long had been a symbol of status and social conventions, was beginning to transform into something different. A place where barriers were broken and hearts finally found the courage to speak their truth. The week that followed the confrontation with Lawrence Maxwell brought subtle but significant changes to the Richardson mansion. Mornings, once marked by a quiet, informal routine, now carried a different electricity in the air. Maria continued her chores with the same dedication as always, but every meeting with Richard was permeated by glances that said more than words. Barbara Graham, always attentive to the nuances of the house she had run for so long, noticed how her boss had started having breakfast later, coinciding precisely with the time Maria was organizing the dining room. Conversations, once limited to practical instructions, now extended into precious moments of hesitant confidences. "Senor, Richard looks tired today," Maria commented one of those mornings, delicately adjusting an arrangement of fresh flowers on the table. "The meetings with the lawyers have been intense," he replied, putting down his tablet. "Lawrence is trying to fight back, threatening to expose alleged irregularities in my business." Maria stopped her movement, the concern evident on her face. "Through my fault?" "No," Richard interrupted her firmly, getting up to approach her. "Because of the truth. And the truth, Maria, sometimes requires us to face storms." Barbara chose that moment to enter, carrying mail. "Mr. Richardson, a letter arrived from the Residents Association, and—" she hesitated. "There are reporters from the New York Times requesting an interview. Apparently, they're interested in doing a story on changing social dynamics in exclusive neighborhoods." Richard and Maria exchanged glances. The press had turned her case into a symbol of social transformation, something much bigger than the simple story of an unjust accusation. "Maybe we should do the interview," Richard suggested, surprising both Barbara and Maria. "Tell our side of the story before others create their own narratives." "Our version?" Maria asked softly, the pronoun carrying significant weight. "Yes," he replied, his voice firm, "because this isn't just your story or my story. It's about something we built together, even without realizing it." Barbara discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone with the weight of that revelation. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken possibilities. "Richard," Maria finally spoke, her hands nervously smoothing her apron. "What exactly did we build?" He moved closer, stopping just a few steps away from her. "Something that defies all the conventions that have surrounded me all my life. Something that makes me question every social role I've accepted without thinking." Outside the mansion, a car braked sharply. Through the window, they saw Eleanor Maxwell hurrying down the drive, her face streaked with tears. "Senora Maxwell?" Maria murmured, instinctively moving towards the door. Barbara quickly reappeared. "Should I send her away?" "No," Maria replied before Richard could speak. "She looks like she needs help." Eleanor entered the dining room like a shadow of her former self, her face devoid of the flawless makeup that had once been her trademark. "I'm sorry to intrude, but Lawrence is selling everything. The house, the cars, even my personal jewelry. He says he'd rather start over somewhere else than face the shame here." Richard gestured for her to sit down. Maria, moved by an instinct for compassion that surprised everyone, including herself, began to prepare a soothing cup of tea. "Eleanor," Richard said softly, "you don't have to follow the path he chose." "No," she laughed bitterly. "What else do I have left? Our entire social circle has abandoned us. People who used to dine at our house now pretend not to know me at the market." Maria returned with the tea, serving it with the same dignity she showed in all her tasks. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we lose everything to find out who we really are." Eleanor looked at her in surprise, as if seeing Maria truly for the first time. "How can you? After everything we've done?" "Because holding a grudge," Maria replied, "is like drinking poison hoping the other person will die." Richard watched the scene with a mixture of admiration and growing affection for Maria. Her ability to show compassion even to those who had hurt her only confirmed what his heart had known for so long. "Eleanor," he interjected, "I can make some calls, help you find a lawyer who specializes in divorce. There's a life beyond Lawrence Maxwell." "And beyond Greenwich?" she asked, a sad little smile playing on her lips. "And beyond all the prisons we build for ourselves," Maria added, surprising everyone with her wisdom. Barbara, who was watching the scene from the doorway, noticed how Richard was looking at Maria at that moment. Not like a boss observing an employee, but like a man discovering, once again, the reasons why his heart had chosen an unexpected path. When Eleanor finally left, calmer and with an initial plan in place, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the French windows. Maria started to collect the teacups, but Richard gently held her hand. "Leave that for later," he said softly. "We need to talk about the interview, and about us." The us hung in the air like a promise and a question. Barbara, realizing the importance of the moment, quietly closed the dining room doors, leaving them alone with their long-held truths. Maria's heart was beating fast as she faced Richard's gaze. The social barriers that separated them seemed simultaneously more fragile and more challenging than ever. But something had fundamentally changed in that house, at that moment. The masks had fallen, and what remained was only the truth of two hearts finding their own way, defying conventions and expectations. The afternoon progressed in Greenwich, and with it, a new story began to unfold. A story no longer defined by titles or social positions, but by the courage to recognize that love, true and deep, does not know the barriers that society tries to impose. The decision to give the interview to the New York Times caused a subtle but perceptible change in the atmosphere of the Richardson mansion. The team of journalists would be arriving in 2 days, and the preparations to receive them transformed the usual routine of the house. Barbara Graham supervised every detail even more rigorously than usual, determined that everything should be impeccable for the photographs that would accompany the story. Maria watched the preparations with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. In her mind, Richard's words still echoed, that meaningful "we" that had changed everything between them. As she arranged the flowers in the large vase in the entrance hall, her hands trembled slightly as she remembered the conversation they had had after Eleanor Maxwell's departure. "What exactly are we going to tell them?" she had asked, her voice low and hesitant. "The truth," Richard had replied simply, "that sometimes it takes an extraordinary event to make us see what has always been before our eyes." Barbara entered the hall, interrupting Maria's memories. "The journalists want photos of you at work," she informed her, as if it were some kind of spectacle. "It's important," replied Richard, who was coming down the stairs at that moment. "We want to show the dignity of work, not create a media circus." Maria instinctively adjusted her uniform. "Maybe I should wear something different for the photos?" "No," Richard and Barbara replied in unison, making her smile. "You're perfect just the way you are," Richard added, his gaze conveying much more than his words. The sound of the doorbell interrupted the moment. It was Marcus Bennett, carrying a thick folder of documents. "I've got news," he announced, following Richard into the office. Maria and Barbara exchanged worried glances before returning to their work. Later, over lunch, which Maria had prepared with special attention, Richard shared the news. "Lawrence Maxwell is leaving the country," he informed her. "Apparently, he's got a post in London. Eleanor has decided to stay and fight for the divorce." "What about the case against Maria?" asked Barbara, who had joined them at the table, a new habit that still seemed surreal to everyone. "Filed," Richard replied with satisfaction. "Unsupported by the original charges, in with Eleanor's confession, there's no case." Maria let out a sigh of relief that she didn't know she was holding in. "Gracias a Dios." "But that's not all," Richard continued, his face taking on a more serious expression. "Marcus warned me about possible repercussions from the interview. Some members of the company's board are worried about the direction things are taking. Because of me," Maria concluded, her heart squeezing. "Because of their prejudice," Richard corrected firmly. "And if I have to choose between their prejudices and," he hesitated, looking directly at Maria, "what is truly important, I have no doubts about my decision." Barbara watched the exchange with moist eyes. In all her years of service, she had never witnessed her boss show so much emotion. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Eleanor Maxwell, looking lighter and more determined than at her last appearance. "I've come to say goodbye," she announced. "I'm moving to Manhattan. A new beginning." Maria, who was serving tea in the winter garden, noticed how different Eleanor looked. Not just in her simpler appearance, but in her posture, her gaze. "You taught me something important, Maria," Eleanor continued, accepting a cup. "About dignity, about being true to yourself, regardless of the circumstances." "The Senora has always had that strength within her," Maria replied gently. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find who we really are." Richard, watching the scene, felt his heart expand with pride and affection. The woman who had won his heart was not only beautiful in her appearance, but in her essence. After Eleanor's departure, the sun began to set over Greenwich, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Maria met Richard in the garden, where he was gazing at the roses she was tending so lovingly. "Tomorrow the journalists will be here," he commented softly. "Are you still prepared for that?" "I'm prepared to face anything," she replied, her voice firm. "As long as we're together." Richard turned to her, taking her hands in his. "Maria, when this story started, I thought I was just defending someone who had been wronged. I didn't realize that I was actually finding my own way to the truth." "And what is that truth?" she asked, her heart beating fast. "That true love knows no social barriers. That what we feel for each other is stronger than any convention or prejudice." Barbara, watching discreetly from the kitchen window, smiled as she saw the two of them together in the garden. Greenwich was changing, and with it, the old structures of power and prejudice were beginning to crumble. Night fell over the Richardson mansion, bringing with it the promise of a new dawn. The next day, their lives would be exposed to public scrutiny, but that night, in the garden scented with Mary's roses, two souls finally found the courage to embrace a truth greater than all social conventions. Love that transcends barriers and transforms hearts. The morning of the interview dawned with a different clarity in Greenwich. Maria woke up before sunrise, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared the special breakfast she had planned for the journalists. The kitchen, her private kingdom for so many years, seemed to vibrate with a new energy, as if the very walls could sense the magnitude of what was about to happen. Barbara Graham entered quietly, watching Maria work with her usual precision. Although her movements betrayed an underlying tension. "They'll be here in 2 hours," the housekeeper informed her softly. "The photographer wants to start with some shots of you in the garden, by the roses." "The roses," Maria smiled, thinking of the night before in the garden with Richard. "They are silent witnesses to so much." "Like all of us in this house," Barbara replied, her usual pragmatism softened by a touch of emotion. "By the way, Eleanor Maxwell called earlier. She asked to wish you luck and said she was rooting for you." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Richard's arrival. He entered the kitchen wearing one of his most elegant suits, but his gaze, when he met Maria's, had the same softness as the night before in the garden. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying an intimacy that made Barbara discreetly withdraw. "Did you sleep well?" "Not much," Maria admitted, pouring him a cup of coffee. "I'm nervous about the interview." Richard gently covered her hand with his on the kitchen counter. "Remember, we're not defending ourselves or justifying ourselves. We're just telling you the truth. Marcus Bennett arrived shortly after, carrying a briefcase with the latest legal details and a tablet showing the morning's headlines. The New York Times isn't the only one interested, he informed us. Several other publications are asking for exclusivity. Keep the focus on the Times, Richard instructed. We want quality, not quantity. The newspaper team arrived punctually at 9 o'clock. The main reporter, Catherine Martinez, was a middle-aged woman with keen eyes and a gentle smile. The photographer, a young man called David Chun, was immediately enchanted by the natural light coming through the French windows. We wanted to capture the real essence of this story, Catherine explained, as they settled into the library for the interview. Not just the superficial scandal, but the profound transformation that happened here. Maria, sitting next to Richard on the leather sofa, felt her heart race when the first question was asked. How did you two realize that what you felt went beyond a professional relationship? Richard smiled softly, his eyes meeting Maria's. I think I always knew, somehow. But sometimes we need a catalyst to make us face truths that we hide even from ourselves. Was the unjust accusation that catalyst? Asked Catherine. It was the moment I realized I could no longer hide behind social conventions, Richard replied. Seeing Maria face that situation with such dignity, it was as if a blindfold had fallen from my eyes. Maria, who until then had remained silent, found her voice. For 5 years, I kept my feelings under wraps, convinced that they were inappropriate, impossible. But when he stood up for me, without hesitation, Barbara, who was watching discreetly from the doorway, noticed how the photographer's eyes lit up as he captured that moment of shared vulnerability. The interview went on for hours, exploring not only their relationship, but the wider social implications. Catherine seemed particularly interested in the changes that were taking place in Greenwich after the incident. Lawrence Maxwell was considered a pillar of this community, she commented. His fall seems to have triggered a lot of questioning about the values here. Sometimes we need something or someone to shake up the structures to realize how fragile they are, Richard replied. The true value of a person is not in their address or bank account, but in their character. During a break for lunch, meticulously prepared by Maria, Catherine observed the natural dynamic between them. The glances exchanged, the small but meaningful gestures, the way they moved in sync through the space. Do you know what strikes me most? She commented to Barbara. It's how everything seems so natural, as if it should always have been like this. The housekeeper smiled, years of silent observation in her expression, because it really should. Some things are just meant to be, no matter how many obstacles there are in the way. When the photographer asked to take the last pictures in the garden, the afternoon sun was creating golden shadows among the roses. Maria, still in her work uniform at her own insistence, smiled as Richard gently adjusted a rose in her hair. This is the photo, murmured David, capturing the moment. The very essence of the story. Catherine closed her notebook, satisfied. You understand that this story is going to cause a lot of buzz, don't you? That some people will criticize it, question it. We understand, Richard replied firmly, his hand finding Maria's. But we've learned the hard way that living to please others is a prison we build for ourselves. When the newspaper team left, the sun was beginning to set over Greenwich. Barbara served tea in the winter garden, where Maria and Richard allowed themselves a moment of quiet after the long day. Tomorrow, everything will be different, Maria murmured, watching the last golden rays through the glass. Yes, Richard agreed, but different doesn't mean worse. It means more real. Barbara, withdrawing discreetly, smiled as she heard the soft murmur of their voices mingling with the nightfall. Greenwich was changing, and with it, old certainties were giving way to new truths, truths of the heart that, once recognized, could no longer be denied. The morning the New York Times story was published brought with it an atmosphere of expectation that hung over Greenwich like a soft mist. Maria woke up before dawn, as she always did. But this time her hands trembled slightly as she prepared breakfast. Through the kitchen window, she could see the first colors of the day painting the sky, turning the rose garden into an impressionist canvas of golden and pink tones. Barbara Graham entered the kitchen carrying several copies of the newspaper, her normally stern face softened by an expression of restrained satisfaction. It's on the front page of the society section, she announced, placing the copies on the counter. The photo that David Chen had captured in the garden occupied a significant amount of space. Maria and Richard among the roses, the exact moment when he was adjusting the flower in her hair. The image perfectly captured the intimacy of the moment, the naturalness of their smiles, the undeniable connection between them. Love beyond conventions. How a Greenwich scandal revealed a story of social transformation, Barbara read aloud. Catherine Martinez has done an exceptional job. Richard came downstairs at that moment, his tablet in hand. The online reactions have already started, he informed her, gently kissing Maria's forehead. As expected, they're varied. Maria took a deep breath, absorbing the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee. What about the company board? Marcus is dealing with that, Richard replied, his voice firm. Some conservative members are uncomfortable, but most understand that we're in an era of change. Besides, he smiled. Our figures have never been better. It's hard to argue against success. The phone started ringing incessantly. Barbara filtered the calls with her characteristic efficiency. Journalists eager for exclusives, curious neighbors, even a few television programs interested in her stories. Eleanor Maxwell called mid-morning. "The story is beautiful," she said, her voice thrilled. "You've shown that it's possible to rebuild life on truer foundations." As the day progressed, a small crowd began to form at the gates of the mansion. Some were reporters, others locals, some supporters, others critics. Maria watched everything from the library window, where she had taken refuge for a moment of reflection. "Are you sorry?" asked Richard, finding her there. "That we made it all public?" Maria turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of emotions. "No, I spent too long living in the shadows, trying not to be noticed. Now," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "now I feel I can finally be whole, be who I really am." Barbara entered the library carrying a tray of tea. "Mr. Maxwell just called from England," she informed him. "Apparently, he's not very happy with the subject." "He'll have to deal with it," Richard replied dryly, "just as we've all had to deal with our own truths." Late afternoon brought an unexpected surprise. A group of maids from other mansions in the neighborhood appeared at the gates, each carrying a rose. It was a silent gesture of solidarity, a powerful statement that Maria and Richard's story had touched something deep in the community. "Look," Maria whispered, moved. "We're not alone on this journey." Richard entwined his fingers in hers, watching the scene through the window. "We never were. It just took us a while to realize that true love doesn't need social approval to exist." Barbara arranged for all the roses to be placed in a large vase in the entrance hall, creating an impressive arrangement that perfectly symbolized the transformation that had taken place in that house. At nightfall, when the hustle and bustle finally began to subside, Richard gathered all the household staff in the winter garden. Maria was by his side, no longer as an employee, but as his equal, his partner. "Changes are coming," he announced. "Some people won't understand or accept it, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that we finally found the courage to be true to ourselves." Barbara, who had served that house for decades, had tears in her eyes. "Some will say this is a fairy tale," she said, "but I've seen this story unfold day after day, year after year. I've seen love grow in the little things, in glances, in gestures, in mutual dedication. There's nothing fantasy about it. It's the most real story I've ever witnessed." Maria looked at the roses in the hall, at the assembled team, at Richard by her side. "When I arrived at this house 5 years ago," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I thought I was just starting a new job. I didn't know I was starting a new life." As the evening progressed, Greenwich seemed different. Not just the exclusive neighborhood it had always been, but a place where old certainties had given way to new possibilities. The Richardson mansion, once a symbol of privilege and tradition, had become a beacon of change. Richard and Maria stayed in the garden long after everyone had left, watching the stars through the glass roof. The roses in the garden swayed gently in the night breeze, their scent a constant reminder of the path they had traveled. "What happens now?" asked Maria, her head resting on his shoulder. "Now," Richard replied, gently kissing her temple, We really start to live. No masks, no fear, just us and the truth we find in each other. Barbara, watching the couple one last time before retiring for the evening, smiled to herself. Greenwich was changing, yes, but some changes were inevitable, like dawn after a long night, like roses blooming in spring, like love finding its way despite all obstacles. The future would be different from what either of them had imagined, but it would be real, and in the end, that's what really mattered.